Regret, gentlemen, I heard nothing today that, in over 6 hours, I heard nothing that suggested to me any Iraqi flexibility whatsoever on complying with the United Nations Security Council resolutions.
We had grave or big differences about the issues we addressed.
War or peace? I can't misrepresent this to the American people. I am discouraged.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
It has not been a good day in so many nations today, but nowhere more so than here. There was a deeply felt anticipation that maybe when the Secretary of State and the Iraqi Foreign Minister had finished their conversations in Geneva, the dimension of the Middle East crisis would somehow be diminished, that the emphasis would be on a political solution. When the two men talked for 6.5 hours, there was a real flurry of optimism, but it was all wishful thinking. The U.S. and Iraq are one day closer to war. We begin in Geneva with our national security correspondent, John McCarthy.
From the moment they sat down this morning, it was a grim and uncompromising conversation. Secretary Baker and Foreign Minister Aziz admitted there was no apparent progress toward a peaceful settlement, and no new ideas were introduced by either side. Each man acknowledged that time is running out and the possibility of war appears to be growing. When it was over, each man presented his case.
Regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, I heard nothing today that, in over 6 hours, I heard nothing that suggested to me any Iraqi flexibility whatsoever on complying with the United Nations Security Council resolutions. There have been too many Iraqi miscalculations.
I made it clear to him that we have not made miscalculations. We are very well aware of the situation.
Baker said he found Iraq's rationale for invading Kuwait less than convincing.
I heard, for instance, that their action in invading Kuwait was defensive in nature, that they were being threatened by Kuwait. And I will tell you the same thing I told the minister, which is I find it very hard to believe.
Instead of discussing a withdrawal from Kuwait, Aziz argued that there could be no settlement of the Gulf crisis without a settlement of the Palestinian problem first. He accused the U.S. of using a double standard in not forcing Israel out of the territories it occupies.
But when it comes to the Arabs, there you raise the stick. And we are fed up with this policy of double standards.
I don't think many people believe that Iraq invaded Kuwait in order to help the Palestinians. And if they did, it was another miscalculation because it hadn't helped the Palestinians. I think most people believe that Iraq invaded Kuwait for Iraq's own aggrandizement.
On the possibility of war, Baker laid out in detail what will happen if Iraq does not withdraw.
Iraq will be choosing a military confrontation which it cannot win and which will have devastating consequences. Don't miscalculate the resolve of the American people, who are very slow to anger, but who believe strongly in principle.
Iraq will defend itself in a very bold manner. We are a courageous nation.
Aziz was asked if Iraq would attack Israel if a war starts.
Yes, absolutely yes.
Aziz claimed Iraq would not be the first to attack anybody. When presented with the letter from President Bush for Saddam Hussein, Aziz read it carefully, then refused to accept it, saying President Bush used inappropriate language for communicating with the Iraqi president. The only issue about which Baker got some cooperation today was on shutting down the American embassy in Baghdad.
We have asked for and received assurances for our remaining 5 diplomatic personnel to leave on the 12th of January.
The embassy is closing down, American officials say, because the U.S. is clearing the decks for a war that both men say their leaders want desperately to avoid. Yet today, after so many hours of talks, the lines in the sand seem to be drawn deeper. Peter?
John, the Secretary today described himself as somber. In his entourage, is there any belief that the political process can be resurrected?
One way to interpret this, Peter, is that the U.S. is playing the bad cop and that other people might be able to play the good cop. In other words, after the stern message from the United States, perhaps Saddam Hussein will be convinced that if he does not do what the U.S. is asking, perhaps through some other channel, that there will be a war. That's what the U.S. is banking on now, another channel.
Okay, John, thanks very much. In a moment, we'll talk about another channel. President Bush said today that he believes Saddam Hussein still does not understand how much force may be used against him. I think Saddam Hussein feels, said the president, that he would prevail. And said the president, he's wrong. At the White House, Brit Hume.
After conferring with Secretary of State Baker by phone and watching Iraqi Foreign Minister Aziz on television, the president did not hide his dismay.
This was a total stiff arm. This was a total rebuff. I watched much of the Aziz press conference. There was no discussion of withdrawal from Kuwait. The United Nations resolutions are about the aggression against Kuwait. They are about the invasion of Kuwait.
The president strongly denied that his rejected letter to Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, which the Iraqi embassy here also spurned, was rude or inappropriate.
I've been around the diplomatic track for a long time. The letter was proper, it was direct, and it was what I think would have been helpful to him to show him the resolve of the rest of the world, certainly of the coalition.
The president said he worries that Saddam doesn't recognize that the coalition will use its formidable force against him. And he held out only slim hope others, such as the UN Secretary General, can sway the Iraqi leader.
I'd have to level with the American people. Nothing I saw today, nothing, leads me to believe that this man is going to be reasonable, that he'll come around. But we ought to keep trying. We ought to keep trying right down to the wire.
There is real disappointment here tonight that today's talks produced no breakthrough. But there is still hope that the Baker mission might have accomplished its more modest original goals, helping sway American public opinion toward the view that President Bush is at least seeking a peaceful solution, and helping convince Saddam Hussein that the coalition arrayed against him means business. Peter?
Britt, one of your colleagues at that news conference today asked the president why he was in a hurry to get on with war. Are those the vibes you get from Mr. Bush?
Well, not exactly, Peter, but it's understandable that some might. He's in the position of trying to create two somewhat paradoxical images. To the American public and to the coalition partners, he wants to seem a man of reason and of peace. But to Saddam Hussein, in order to get him to get out of Kuwait, he wants to seem a man of war. It's not hard to understand why some might get the two images confused.
Okay, Brit Hume at the White House, thank you very much. Some of my colleagues are still waiting on the line, including ABC's Ted Koppel, who's in Geneva tonight to do Nightline. As you know, Ted, there was a suggestion from both delegations today that the UN Secretary General might yet go to Baghdad. But do you think we're looking at the end of the diplomatic process?
No, I don't think we are, Peter, and I think, first of all, we have to take a look at that January 15th deadline and see it for what it is. It is not a day upon which war is necessarily going to begin. In fact, I think we'd all be tremendously surprised if the war did begin on the 15th or the 16th, or even during the immediate days thereafter. Nor is January 15th a date on which the diplomatic process, for any reason, has to end. There are, as we've already indicated, and as our colleagues have indicated on this program, there are a number of diplomatic initiatives that you've already spoken of, not the least of them being that by the UN Secretary General. The French government has made it quite clear that it is going to push its own diplomatic initiatives. There are others in the European community who'll be pushing them, and within the Arab world who'll be pushing them. So I think that what has really happened today is that the United States has pushed as hard as it can the notion that it, at least, has done everything it can. It is prepared to go to war. It is now waiting, of course, for Congress to, in effect, sanctify what the UN Security Council has already done and give the president its approval for going to war if necessary. So all the ducks are in a row. But I think between now and then, the diplomatic process still has a chance.
Ted, we all know that the press is not always the best barometer of things. Here today, there's a real deep mood of pessimism as a result of all this. What about in Geneva?
Well, I can understand that, Peter, because you and I have been talking to one another since early this morning, Geneva time, and the fact of the matter is, when we began this day, it looked very grim. When we looked at those two delegations, the Iraqi and the American, confronting one another across the table, it looked very grim. But then as each of those 6.5 hours passed, we began to believe that surely after so much time, something would emerge, something positive. So I have to tell you that the mood here in Geneva tonight is certainly not optimistic. I was simply responding to your question. I don't think the diplomatic process is dead.
Okay, Ted, thanks very much. Let's move on to London, where ABC's Pierre Salinger has been actually monitoring the French initiative for some period of time. Pierre, the French seem very ready to go on with diplomacy now, almost vigorously ready. But what makes them think they could succeed where the U.S. appears to be failing?
Well, Peter, as a matter of fact, since the end of the meeting in Geneva, they have become quite pessimistic about their diplomatic initiative, which they're going to launch tomorrow. They had hoped that perhaps they could get something done before the evening of January 15th. But I am hearing a word from the Élysée Palace, which is the French White House, that after what they've seen, what happened in Geneva today, they are less optimistic about what they can accomplish. In any case, though, they're going to send their foreign minister, Roland Dumas, to Baghdad, but they're not the only ones who are going to try. The European community still wants to have a meeting with Tariq Aziz, even though Tariq Aziz said that he would not meet them in Algiers. They may also have to go to Baghdad. The Swiss foreign minister has sent private notes to both Tariq Aziz and James Baker, saying that he's ready to mediate between them.
Okay, Pierre, thanks very much. Let's move finally back to Geneva, where ABC's Barry Dunsmore has been listening to the Iraqis and the Secretary of State today. Barry, at the end of this very long day, you just cannot miss the enormous difference in priorities Mr. Baker and Mr. Aziz appear to have for the Middle East. What's the clue to us understanding the foreign minister from Iraq today?
Well, Peter, we begin with the premise that Tariq Aziz was going to be self-serving to justify what may be considered unjustifiable. But when he begins to talk about the double standard that the West holds against the Arabs, he's certainly going to strike a responsive chord with millions of Arabs, and it's not just over the Israeli issue. For many centuries, the Arabs have been treated like third-class citizens and have been told by the colonial powers, do what we say, not what we do. And so when he was able to stand up there speaking good English and explain quietly the exposition of the Arab position, he was probably making a lot of very good points and probably making a lot of Arabs feel that he had a very definite point to make. Now, this may not be particularly good, it may not solve anything, but it probably won't do any harm either for that to have been said.
Okay, Barry Dunsmore in Geneva, and my other colleagues as well, thank you. In a moment, the Congress makes final preparations for its debate about war.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Brought to you by Just for Men Hair Coloring.
It was only yesterday that President Bush announced he would ask Congress to back up his policy of using force if necessary to get Iraq out of Kuwait, and that debate on the Hill will start tomorrow. ABC's Jim Wooten reports that the events in Geneva have caused some of the undecided to decide in the president's favor.
They were merely spectators today, Republican Senators Dole and Warner, watching the dismal drama of Geneva unfold, hoping the failure there will convince their colleagues here to rally round the president. And indeed, some Democrats who watched with the president at the White House already have.
Well, I think the fact that Hussein has completely ignored reality is going to affect the debate. I think my prediction would be that a majority of members will support the president.
We're at the point of either fishing or cutting bait or doing something. You know, you just can't leave 450,000 men and women out there forever without knowing what's going to happen here.
Then Chairman Fassel came back to Capitol Hill and called his House Foreign Affairs Committee into session to hammer out the resolutions the House will begin debating tomorrow. In all probability, there'll be 3 of them. One would urge Mr. Bush to wait until sanctions have time to take effect. Another would reaffirm the constitutional authority of Congress alone to declare war. And the third would authorize the president to use all necessary means to implement the United Nations resolution. And that, of course, is what the president wants. And now, given the failure in Geneva, it's what most members of Congress believe will pass.
Neither the United Nations nor Jim Baker blinked. Now, the question is, will the Congress blink?
And the answer is, well, the answer is that after a couple of days of fierce debate beginning tomorrow, the Congress will probably give the president exactly what he wants, knowing there's no way to stop him from doing what he wants anyway. Jim Wooten, ABC News, Capitol Hill.
The news from Geneva produced some enormous swings in the financial markets today. After dropping early in the day, the price of oil jumped nearly $7 a barrel in 10 minutes. It finally closed at just over $27 a barrel, about where it was yesterday. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrials, which had been up more than 40 points, finished the day down 39 to close at 2470, and that is a swing of more than 80 points. And the trading was heavy. We'll be back in just a moment.